is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The fight against corruption in Africa has mixed outcomes, some good news and some not so good news. In other words, to say, as has often been said in some quarters, that all of Africa is corrupt is incorrect and misleading, according to the 2021 Global Corruption Perception Index. The CPI ranks the Seychelles, Botswana, Mauritius, Rwanda and Namibia as Africa's top performers in the fight against corruption. But South Sudan, Somalia and the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi and Equatorial Guinea appear to be struggling, according to the CPI. So why are some countries doing well in Africa and others struggling? That is the question we seek to answer in this week's program. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, let's now bring in our panel of guests, all joining us via Zoom. Joining in from Kigali, Apollinaire Mupiganyi, Executive Director, Transparency International, Rwanda. And in Cape Town, Daniel Van Dalen, Senior Analyst at Signal Risk. A very warm welcome to you both, gentlemen, and thank you for being a part of this discussion. Apollinaire, if I may start off with you. Now, the 2021 Corruption Perceptions Index indicates that efforts to fight corruption are at a standstill worldwide and that 131 countries and territories have made no significant progress against corruption over the last decade. Now, African countries in particular are ranked among the most poorly performing in the corruption index. Why is this the case?
First of all, yes, corruption remains one of the main challenge or main issues affecting equitable access to growth. And of course, when we talk about corruption, Africa is more affected, but no country worldwide is immune of corruption. But the African countries are sharing or have this, the same challenges, the governance challenges. In Africa, monopoly and state capture are common in many countries. Furthermore, Africa countries, those who are ranking as more prone to corruption, have the same issues: insecurity, armed group, and other threats that contribute to corruption to flourish. So it's a combination of factors that our continent is facing, and more specifically in those countries that are more prone to corruption are facing, which make corruption easy to happen. So this is probably the difference to other democracies that are performing well in Corruption Perception Index as per Transparency International ranking.
Daniel, I wanted to put that to Daniel as well. Why is this the case?
I think over, in the entire world, corruption is effectively, there, it's prevalent, and we also have a lot of blame that gets put on the African continent. Well, everyone's corrupt, all of that kind of thing. But I think in terms of corruption, one should almost look at the development of a country and a continent. Africa is, post-colonial era, institutions, government, nation buildings have only had, less than, from the 60s to develop institutions, political systems. All these processes take hundreds of years to unfold in other countries. And now as countries have to kind of steer and navigate these things, building on institutions that weren't, necessarily geared towards the entire population, it takes time to build these institutions up. I'm not obviously excusing, the leaders that took over, and then we do know that some countries are far worse than others. But I think it just takes time in terms of to configure a country, and through that development process, there's going to be issues along the way. And I think, yes, if we, corruption perception index is the, perception is the main thing there, is that on the continent, it will obviously look like there is far more corruption than elsewhere. But because of how, the continent has developed, it's going to look a lot worse because of obviously the impact that has, especially on economies of, the size and in developments and that kind of thing.
Apollinaire, when we look at the varied response to the African continent, though, there. How accurate is the corruption perception index? How objective is it? And what criteria exactly is used to determine the levels and the extent of corruption?
At least Transparency International, who is the custodian of this scoring, who developed for the first time this index, uses other source of data. For a country to be ranked under a corruption perception index, it requires at least 3 sources of data. Among other sources of information, Transparency International uses, for example, Africa Development Bank governance data, the World Economic Forum, the World Bank data, Batemes Foundation index, to name but the few, meaning that it's not really perception. Of course, it requires, as the data are collected by the expert and investors knowing or having information on the governance on a specific country. I think the CPI provides the broad picture on the level of corruption in a specific country, which is ranked under the CPI scoring. But again, just to conclude, it goes through a very robust quality assurance process, and the errors are somehow contained through a very robust statistical approaches used by the Transparency International researchers.
What are the implications, though, for those countries and territories that are listed negatively in the report? Does it have a deterrent effect?
The impact or the consequence of corruption on daily life of citizens is very, very high. And security, this is one of the implications due to corruption. Let's give you an example. In a country where corruption is endemic, it's very easy illegal businesses, and this is scaling up the security. But more importantly, for economic growth, corruption discourages the investors. We have seen that investors are looking where the doing business or competition is fair. In the countries where corruption is endemic, no investor will be motivated to go to invest. But of course, the daily life of the ordinary citizens is affected. Only the power holders are benefiting disproportionately compared to the ordinary citizens who can't afford the cost of corruption. So I think it's a very bad situation in terms of equal opportunity for all citizens, but as well as the economic growth is jeopardized because there is no investment, no trust in the governance system in such specific countries.
Daniel, do you feel that this is an accurate assessment of the corruption index on the continent, though?
Yeah, listen, my opinions earlier, I think, is more of a general opinion of what the West maybe has on Africa. But in terms of the CPI, obviously, as Apollinaire said, they are using country level people, they're using external sources, things like the African Development Bank. So in my opinion, it's a fair assessment if you look at the methodology that, Transparency International uses. But like I said, to bring it back to my previous point, unfortunately, because the continent is still going through the stage of development, there are going to be issues along the way in terms of how governance is developed, and I think as a continent, we're getting there, and you see a lot of countries moving up the ranks over the past couple of years as well. So I think as a whole, the CPI is a very accurate representation. But like I said, I think it just, in terms of where a lot of African countries stand, is because of obviously where they've had to come from in such short amount of time in terms of their development and, political institutions and all those things. Apollinaire,
the UN Conference on Trade and Development estimates that Africa loses about $88.6 billion US, or 3.7% of its GDP annually in illicit financial flows. Quantify for us the actual cost of corruption to the continent. What is the magnitude, and at what level? Is it largely petty or grand corruption?
It's very difficult to estimate the cost of corruption, or what Africa is losing on an annual basis due to corruption. Illicit financial flows is one of the form of or one of the consequence of corruption, especially the money laundering and other forms of corruption. But what is very, very clear is that Africa is losing huge resources in monetary resources and natural resources due to corruption. And at the same time, we are bargaining, or we are begging development partners to support us while the resources are somehow taken abroad. So I think there is a kind of contradiction on Africa aspiration for its development. I think our leaders need to take strong action against corruption. As Daniel mentioned, we are seeing some countries really taking corruption as a threat. The example that I can share is for my country, Rwanda. In 2012, Rwanda was among the corrupt, before 2012, Rwanda was ranked among the very high corrupt countries. And 10 years after, we are seeing Rwanda among the 5 least corrupt countries. So I think it's fighting corruption, stop illicit financial flow due corruption, be it internally and externally, because illicit financial flows can take place national level, regional level, and global level. So I think it's possible when there is political will and a strong institutions, and of course anti-corruption machinery very well integrated and coordinated.
Daniel, you've talked about Africa looking more corrupt because it is still going through stages of development. But what loopholes do you find are existing that are being exploited in order for corruption to flourish? Under what circumstances exactly do we see the various levels and stages of corruption emerging?
Yeah, I think it comes down to institutional, frameworks that just don't exist in a lot of these countries. And, in the post-colonial era, a lot of these guys were still trying to figure it out. Obviously, in the same way that opened it up for a lot of, there was not a lot of oversight. In a place, for example, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, their anti-money laundering framework didn't exist. So the Financial Action Task Force recently approached them and, they got the review and they said, well, you guys now need to develop this framework, to counter, money laundering, for example. And there's a lot of countries that don't have legislation that curtails acts of corruption. There's lack of oversight in certain places. Again, I'm not saying this is everywhere, and it is, one should take it country dependent, but I think it comes down to political will, and are you willing to, create, a state that is capable of trying to root it out? And I think that takes time with political will, and I don't think that political will has been there, but we are starting to, at least in my opinion, starting to see that tide change with new leaders coming in, over the past couple of years, where that political will is starting to change. You're seeing new legislation come in. You're seeing, shake-ups to, countries that we historically perceived as, highly corrupt. They still are corrupt, but, the legislation is being passed. Departments are being created to start to alter that as time goes on.
All right. Well, on that note, let's take a short break. And when we come back, we will delve deeper into Africa's fight against the scourge of corruption, focusing more on solutions. Stay with us. Welcome back to the program. Let's continue with our discussion. Still with us in Kigali, Apollinaire Mupiganyi, and in Cape Town, South Africa, Daniel Van Dalen. Daniel, very interesting notions have been brought up as to exactly what causes and what is driving corruption. There's often a notion that poor pay in the public service is fueling the need for corruption. Do higher wages for bureaucrats, for instance, reduce corruption? Can competition or competitive business practices also reduce corruption? What is it?
In Tanzania, for example, corruption, under John Magufuli within the police force was quite extensive. And, President Hassan has now come in and she's done exactly what you just described, where, Tanzania is now trying to curtail corruption within the police force by adding, higher ups get a better salary, the officers get a better salary. However, you can't just do that in itself. So I think it's the case of maybe add a bit more incentives, but you also then need to refine the institution that, a culture within a body as well. I don't think it's as easy as just saying, we're going to give them higher salaries so they're not going to do, go into corruption. I mean, in South Africa, we have ministers earning salaries that, most people in the country can only dream of, but they're engaging in grand acts of corruption, irrespective of salary. So I don't think it's as easy as that. I think it is very much a culture, not a cultural, I suppose an internal cultural thing of, a culture of government or a culture of institution. And can you root that out as well as, coincide that with obviously giving people better pay and that kind of stuff, so you're less tempted. But I don't think it's as easy as just creating more competition or merely just adding a higher salary.
Well, but Daniel, you've also talked about the political will, and without political will, the fight against corruption is largely doomed. So when you look across the board, though, is there a real political will? And what are some of the challenges faced in trying to overcome corruption, both at a political and institutional level?
You need widespread reforms, you need institutional reforms, and you need that to come from the top and say, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're going to fix. That, it doesn't just happen overnight. And I think, this goes back to the earlier point of this is where the leadership change in Africa and, any country that is corrupt, that needs to happen first before, you're going to see the cogs turn, before these processes start coming in. And even then, new leader comes in, as I referred to earlier, they then have to then still consolidate it and change the culture within the institution before they can start doing that. A prime example would be President Hassan in Tanzania. She came in, there was a lot of infighting within the ruling CCM about how this was going to go, and Hassan has chosen to reform, the politics, the economy, but it took time, but she focused on changing the culture, within the systems that exist already, and then doing everything to incentivize it, and putting in legislation, doing that. Same with the Democratic Republic of Congo. It took time for Felix Tshisekedi to, consolidate their control, root out Kabila's allies, and then he could say, well, we're going to now start putting forward legislation that's going to slowly but surely correct the system. To conclude, that brings it back to the penultimate point of you need the political will at the top to spearhead these, otherwise it doesn't happen.
Apollinaire, what's your view? Because Rwanda has undergone this process and come up with favorable results. What were some of the challenges Rwanda had to overcome, both at a political and institutional level?
Here in Rwanda, those who are in position of power or governance, they know that they are there to serve the citizens. Otherwise, if there is any suspicion, any report on them, they are immediately dismissed. So one of the things that is very important is not tolerating impunity. Impunity is one of the thing that's increase the level of corruption. The other thing is try to, of course, I know that in South Africa and other countries they are advanced more than us, but digitalization of the services, it's very, very important. That's limiting the contact between service providers, service seekers is very, very key. Otherwise, when there is such contacts, there is a kind of temptation. So, but more importantly, of course, the implementation, the laws, zero tolerance, impunity, and of course, empowering the citizens, giving them the opportunity to report when they are victim of corruption or witness any bad practices. I think, I don't know if because we are a small country, but Rwanda is an integrated society where information is immediately shared, especially when someone is suspected, someone in a position of leadership. They are really, the punishment is very, very high. The moral, the social sanction is very, very high. Very recently, there is a state of minister who was suspected with under prosecution, suspected of bribery. He was immediately suspended and now facing the courts. And other high-level officials. I think such good examples of punishment of high officials gives lessons to others to refrain. I think it's the impunity would not be a very good thing to promote. This is why Rwanda really they are punishing very seriously, and the law has put the punishments very, very high, at least 5 years in jail. You have to think twice before you are involved in corruption practices. Yeah.
All right, Daniel, we have heard that Rwanda's measures are quite punitive, though. But for other countries, do we know what kind of regulatory frameworks or anti-corruption institutions are working in some countries that are doing favorably in containing this corruption versus those that are hugely corrupt?
I will flag it to a few countries where you're starting to see the change happen. So an example for me would be Tanzania, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Angola. So we've all had leadership changes in the past few years. You know, initially, obviously slow start, but suddenly you're seeing the arrests. Suddenly you're seeing legislation being developed that it makes it a hell of a lot harder. You're seeing, you know, as Apollina has said, you're seeing prosecutions, and that's the important thing. You know, it's not these things of they're investigating, but yeah, nothing's really happening. You know, Angola is a prime example. The dos Santos, you know, children are all facing various legal proceedings, you know, international courts. Domestically, there's a huge trial that's still going on at the moment with, you know, old ex-military and dos Santos regime personnel that are all, you know, 40 to 50 to 60 of them, you know, that are all facing trial because of their involvement in corruption. You know, Tanzania, there are local officials that are getting dismissed left, right, and center because of their implications in these things. So I think, you know, in the DRC, there's still a very long way to go. It's such a big country, it's such a big government, and you're talking decades of corruption there that is probably insurmountable to try and fix, and, you know, a kind of culture that you would need to address. But I think, you know, where we're seeing the positive stuff, and again, this comes down to top down, where the leaders are spearheading it, they're letting the legislation go, but prosecutions are following, and that's the important thing. You know, even, this is going to sound a bit of an off the beat one, but in a place like Guinea, you know, the coup that took place was largely a result of misgovernance, excessive corruption. And you look at the ruling junta now, obviously I'm not endorsing coups, but it's the case of, you look at what they've done is they take corruption so seriously that they ended up creating an entire court, and they're now addressing every act of corruption under former administrations and even current administrative bodies. So, you know, I'm not saying take a coup to address corruption, but it's the case of you need to take proper steps from the top. And those are the countries that, you know, are showing it in a sense, where the leaders are taking action and the legislation and the culture change is gradually following.
All right. So, you know, it's a top to bottom approach from both of you in this discussion. Apollinaire, we do know, though, that the regional bodies like, you know, ECOWAS, SADC, the African Union, they all have established protocols on corruption. But is the continent, though, are the institutions that are tasked with moving the continent forward, are they taking corruption as seriously as they should on a continental level?
The fact that we have already those regional and continental bodies that are already aware of the bad effects of corruption and initiate some actions, it's already recommendable. Just to give you an example, on African Union Convention in Preventing and Fighting Corruption, which is a continental instrument established to fight corruption. This is already a political message that is shared continental level to say that we are not proud, we are ashamed with the image of Africa on the level of corruption. But again, what is discouraging is that not all countries have ratified this instrument. We are seeing some countries which are still reluctant or observing or inactive in this continental action. So I think it's very important that we have additional catalyzers, which include, among others, civil society on our continent, need to be more active on a continental level to make sure that our regional and continental instruments are effective. We need a very active civil society and, of course, coordinated and working together to demand power holders to account for common good. But again, it's commendable to see such a political message, affirmative action to fight corruption. But again, we need the results, which are still delaying to come.
All right, we're going to wind up in a moment, but I want to get your final comment. Daniel, I'll start off with you because everyone agrees that corruption has an enormous impact on development in African countries. What is the answer to addressing the corruption challenge?
Listen, I don't think there's a catch-all answer. I think, both myself and Apollinaire have spoken about the various things that need to take place for that, that to happen. But, I think on a country level, we need to start, those leaders need to change. We need to move beyond the guys that, have entrenched the corruption culture in a lot of these countries. And I think that wave is slowly coming, as we've seen in, elections over the past couple of years. As Apollinaire said, there needs to be definitely a stronger civil society that can hold the state accountable. And I think an example of that is South Africa, which is very good. We have a strong civil society that does hold them accountable. And, to an extent, they're allowed to. And I also think that also needs to be the case, where there needs to be a space where civil society can say, well, this is what we found, you shouldn't be doing this. And I think that needs to change. I also think, on a regional and continental level, there can definitely be more action taken. It's not just the case of, as Apollinaire has said, it's just rhetoric. There needs to be action on the part of these continental bodies to say, if you're not performing, we need to do something. So I think it's a multifaceted approach in terms of how you deal with it. But in my personal opinion, I think, from what I've seen over the past 5 years, the change comes, when the old guard in certain countries are removed and you can start facilitating those changes over time. But until that happens, unfortunately, countries will stagnate in their kind of move forward in addressing corruption. All
right, Apollinaire, your thoughts?
I think there is a need of empowering the ordinary citizen, the general public, the community, the citizens. I want to quote the founder of Transparency International, Peter Hagen. He said, everyone or citizen should know that they have power to make change in the corruption environments. And this change is when there is a critical mass of those who are against these bad practices. I think together, if we empower our community, and of course, we have a positive feedback from the policymakers, of course, if they understand, corruption can be decreased on our continent. So I think let's not be alarmists. Of course, we are facing the cost of corruption on our continent is very, very high. The cost of corruption on our ordinary citizen on that basis for African citizens is very high. Sometimes it's equal to death in the health sector, in education, and other sectors critical for the daily life of the citizens. But let's be optimistic that it is possible from the experience of successful countries on our continent.
All right, gentlemen, thank you all so much for your input. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our panel of experts. In Kigali, Apollinaire Mupiganyi, Executive Director, Transparency International in Rwanda. And in Cape Town, Daniel Van Dalen, Senior Analyst at Signal Risk. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and Twitter. And you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, bye-bye.